Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to go through common Octane render settings to help you get started and understand the important options inside of Octane and Houdini. This is a little bit more of a slower paced video and where we're going to go in a little bit more detail. If you're an Octane veteran, this might not be for you, but if you're new to Octane or you just want to learn how to navigate these key settings inside of the Houdini Octane plugin, this is for you. Feel free to use chapters in the description if you're looking for something specific. Otherwise, we're going to go through the render target and the ROP section by section. I'll highlight the settings I use today. Probably won't be a deep technical dive into every setting, but I'll explain the ones that I find important and helpful in most common situations. In this video, we're going to use the combined Octane render setup node, which merges the render target and ROP into one. However, none of these settings change if you use the separate nodes. This is just a more convenient setup. So let's start with the Kernel tab. So there are a few kernel types in Octane. There's direct lighting, which is simpler and faster, but is less realistic. It has a few different global illumination modes. Disabled means no global illumination. Ambient occlusion is a simplified version, and then diffuse is like closer to path tracing. I think the direct lighting kernel is actually probably underused, underappreciated, because it's really fast and still produces really good results. You don't need the highest global illumination accuracy. However, if you have like a more complex scene or you want like the higher levels of realism, then maybe you can skip this one. Then we have the info kernel. This one's used for just rendering info passes, like for example, normals or positions or wireframes. It's very fast, but obviously doesn't do like full path tracing. Then we have the path tracing kernel. And this is like the main kernel most people use. It's a really balanced option between speed and realism and what Octane is most known for. We're going to dive into this one a bit deeper. And then there's PMC, which is the most accurate, especially for lighting and caustic effects, but it's also the slowest. And most people don't use this one, but feel free to play with it if you're looking for the highest level of realism. And then there's the photon tracing kernel. It's very similar to path tracing. I believe it actually mostly uses the same math underneath, but it includes photon-based caustics. And this is really useful when you want realistic caustics with like glass or diamonds or the caustics on the bottom of a pool, the kind of wavy texture. However, this probably deserves a video of its own, and so we're probably going to make one for this in the future, but in the meantime, to learn more about caustics, I would highly recommend Silverwing VFX video on this. It's a similar 4D video, but most of the things he talks about also apply to Houdini. So let's talk about the path tracing kernel. So first of all, you have max samples, and this is like just the overall max samples that the render engine will use per pixel. So obviously, if you set a really low value, like 12, it'll give you very noisy renders, and you can just increase this value until you're happy with the noise level. Then we have the diffuse, specular, and scatter depth, and this basically controls how many times a ray bounces for each time of interaction. So diffuse is for normal light bounces, specular is for glass and reflections, and scatter is for volumes and subsurface scattering. I usually start with a value of 4 for each one, and then just increase until I don't really see like an improvement. Max overlapping volumes is pretty much what it sounds like. If you have multiple volumes that are overlapping, then you might have artifacts and you might have to increase this value. The subdivision level just limits globally the geometry subdivisions that are set in the Octane object settings. Then GI clamp and caustic blur, these are two settings that I use pretty frequently to kind of deal with noise in the scene. So GI clamp really helps to deal with fireflies. Basically, if a ray is too bright, it gets clamped. So just be careful if you set this too low, you're probably going to lose highlight detail, especially in like caustic heavy scenes. Just play with it and see where the image starts to break or things get too dark. Caustic blur blurs the caustics, so kind of like makes them less fine, but that can also help reduce noise at the cost of sharpness. And you can kind of like try different values here. But if you're using glass, you probably don't want this to set this too low. Otherwise, you're going to lose some detail there. Then ray epsilon, this is important for intersection accuracy. So if geometry is like really close together, for example, you have like a sticker on top of a surface, and if this value is like bigger than the distance between the sticker and the surface, you're going to have some intersection artifacts. On the other side, if your scene is really big, like a huge landscape, if you have this too low, you might get flickering or just issues there. So it kind of depends on your scene size and what you have going there. Filter size just adds like a soft blur across the whole render, and this is just used to basically reduce aliasing. Usually just leaving it at default is fine. Alpha shadow setting, this one just changes how alpha channels in a texture or in a material are treated when it comes to casting shadows. Then nested dielectrics, this is needed for when you have multiple transmissive objects inside of each other, for example, water inside of a water glass or ice in water. And inside the material, you can set the priority, and basically the further an object is from the camera, the lower the priority needs to be. Or better, the further inside an object is, the lower the priority needs to be. Alpha channel and keep environment, these affect, for one, whether there's an alpha channel, and then whether the background environment is kept in the alpha channel. Do note that there's one setting for alpha in the ROP, which dictates whether or not the alpha is pre-multiplied or not when saved to the file. All right, in the sampling tab, first of all, we have the adaptive sampling setting. And this setting is amazing and makes rendering so much faster, because basically what it does is it checks the noise level, and if the noise level goes below this noise threshold, then it's going to stop rendering that area and just focus on the noisy areas in the scene. So for the minimum adaptive samples, the default is 512, but I think that's way too high, because this sets how long at a minimum the scene's rendered across the frame. And I want this to stop as soon as it's clean enough. So I often set this to a lower value, like 48. For example. And then your noise threshold obviously sets how clean an area needs to be for it to stop rendering. So the higher you set this, the more noisy it will keep the image. And then pixel grouping basically determines whether it evaluates noise per pixel or per like a group of pixels. A lot of people set this to none. I usually leave it at 2x2, and it seems to be working fine. So path termination power helps optimization, and basically like when the ray's energy drops below a certain level, it's discarded. Direct light samples, self-explanatory. Current ratio, this one can help speed up your render. However, it causes visible artifacts that don't disappear until higher sample counts. I usually don't use this, but it's something you can play with. Static noise just keeps the pattern of the noise consistent between frames. So if you're using an AI denoiser, it might help with some of the jitter. Obviously, if you're not denoising it, then it'll have kind of like a static film grain. And then parallel and max tile samples. These can improve performance. However, I haven't found them to make much of a difference, but again, feel free to play with those. In the light panel, we have AI light, and this basically enables smarter sampling based on light sources. So this is really useful when you have scenes with a lot of lights. I have found that it really doesn't make a big difference in like lower samples, up to like 128 samples or something. I feel like sometimes it's even slower. But once it gets into those higher sampling rates, it gets like smarter and smarter about which direction to like pull the light samples towards, and seems to clean images much better if you have a lot of lights going on. For the light ID action, this dropdown basically changes how the row underneath behaves. So if you set this to disable, any light paths that you select will be disabled. If you click enable, it's going to by default disable all the lights and then only enable certain lights. And this is very useful for like troubleshooting or maybe soloing a certain light pass. And then invert, basically when you're using a light mask on an object, it just basically inverts that. So let's say in one object in the scene, you disable the light mask ID, the light would be disabled for that. But if you set the invert setting, now it will by default disable it for all lights except for the ones that have the light mask unchecked. So it kind of just inverts the way light masking works for that specific light ID. The deep image setting, this is something that I've recently more discovered, and basically when enabled, Octane stores multiple depth samples per pixel. So in this example, we have this like slightly translucent red object in front of the cube, and so what the deep image does, it actually saves multiple samples, one time when it hits the translucent object, and then when it hits the cube behind it, alongside with its depth information. And so when we bring this into our compositing software, we can actually composite something between those layers. It also does a really good job at the edges of objects. You get really clean combination without any kind of like edge fringing or anything like that. However, it does not work with everything. So for example, if you use transmission, like a glass object, that won't work. But if you use opacity, that does work. But it's also really powerful to combine multiple renders. For example, if you render environment and then a hero character, this could help combine the two very seamlessly, because it automatically would merge what's in front, what's behind, without having to do any kind of masking or anything like that. So let's move on to the environment tab. The left drop down is for your lighting source, so like your HDR light, and the right drop down is just for the background, so this doesn't really affect the lighting. We have a few different environment types. We have preview lighting, which is kind of like a studio lighting setup with a few different lights that you can just modify. I've really enjoyed this. It's a really easy way to just get some good looking like studio type setups from the get-go. Then we have the Octane daylight setting, which is a procedural sun and sky system where you can like simulate like a location on Earth and a time of day, and it will create light that's accurate to those settings. And there is planetary, which you can use for like planet rendering or like stars or atmosphere. You can change the height here. So if you want to be like on the surface of this planet, you can set the height to 0. Or if you want to, if you like have like a satellite floating above it, you can set it higher. And then we have our texture environment, which is like your standard HDRI setup. Be aware that you can do adjustments here. And then also pretty much all of these environment types will have a medium setting. Here you can add like a fog. And then we also have solid and gradient, which are pretty much what they sound like. Solid is just a solid color, environment color, and then gradient, basically gradient going from the bottom to the very bottom to the very top. And then we pretty much have all the same ones on for the back plate, but like I mentioned before, those won't really affect the lighting. They're really just there for the background where there's nothing else in the scene. Quick note here, there are quite a few camera settings on the Octane Render setup node, but then some of the settings are actually on the camera itself, and it uses the native Houdini settings. So things like the focal length, the resolution is set here. If you're on the thin lens, the projection is changed here. Aperture, the clipping, ortho width also, this is for if you have the orthographic camera. And then also on the sampling, so while the shutter time is not used, the focus distance and the f-stop is used from the camera. So just be aware of that. Some of the settings are in the camera node, and then some of them are in the Octane Render setup. All right, in the camera tab, we have a few different cameras. There's the universal camera, which combines basically a few of these lenses into one and gives you actually some more options than just the thin lens by itself would have, because you have like the option to diopter, which is like a split focus. You have distortion settings, and then all the cameras have the option to do like stereo output, so like 3D rendering. Then we have the realistic lens, and this is a new lens that uses like real world presets. Can't really zoom because these are all like primes, but you can kind of crop, kind of semi-zoom using a sensor crop using the sensor width. Then there's the baking camera, and this is used to bake lighting for video game type setups. And then there's OSL camera. By default, the render target comes with the OSL script, but you can actually dive inside and load a custom OSL script. If you go on the Otoy website on the download page, under asset packs, the Machina Infinitum, there's a Vectron Tools V10 zip file there. And if you download that and look inside, there's some OSL camera files there. One important thing to note is that all the lenses have an autofocus setting, and this is on by default, meaning that it ignores your focal distance setting in the camera and just automatically focuses the lens on whatever's in front of it. If you want to manually focus the lens, you need to disable that. The Imager tab, this includes like post-render adjustments that are applied after rendering. So the image setting, you can modify things like exposure, saturation, vignette. There's a cool setting here for hot pixel removal, which can really help to clean up some fireflies that are still hanging around. And then we have our tone mapping tab, and there's a one-click button here to enable ASIS, which is wonderful. However, if you leave that off, you have a lot more refined controls. The color space for your final file is defined in the ROP. The settings in the tone mapping only apply to your IPR unless you're rendering to sRGB to PNG. So for denoising, we have two denoisers. We have the Octane AI denoiser, and we have the Open Image denoiser. They're both really good. In some cases, the Open Image denoiser might be slightly better. However, they're both excellent. And then we have the upsampler. This basically will render the image at a lower resolution and then use AI to upscale it. I found that this can be okay for previews, but I don't know that I would use this on a final production image. And then we have our post-processing tab. This handles, different post-processing stuff like blooms, glares, lens flares, chromatic aberration. And then on the other side, we have the post-volume effects. And so the light beams basically lets you create free, basically, post-effects light beams, which is much faster than using like an environment medium. For this to work, you have to either use a directional or analytic light and enable the use in post-volume setting. And then the fog settings basically gives you like a Z-depth fog, but what's cool is you can also set like a fog height and fall off. So if you want to do like a mountain scene where the fog's sitting in the valleys but not coming up to the top, that's something you can use as well. Now we get to the AOVs. We have all the typical beauty passes and info passes here. A few things to note under the auxiliary section under the general tab. If you enable post-processing, it will disappear from your beauty pass and will end up in its own post-processing AOVs, so you can composite it in later. If you're using cryptomats and you want to preview them in the IPR, you can enable LDR tone mapping, and that will show them correctly in the IPR. Also, on cryptomats, the new render target separates them between stable and unstable. Just note that if you use the ones that are not under the stable section, they will probably change from frame to frame, so probably not the best thing to use for animations. Under the beauty pass, you can also see the denoise, albedo, and normal passes. If you want to use the open image denoise in your compositing software, if you output these two passes, you can use those to basically denoise the image in post. Or you can use them to denoise other AOVs inside of Octane using the output AOVs that I'll go into in just a second. And then for the custom AOVs, for those to work, you have to use capture to custom AOV node inside of your material. And then you can basically capture like a custom texture into a custom AOV. But what's cool is you can also use the override texture. And so you could basically include a texture in this custom AOV that doesn't actually show up in the render. This only works if a texture is plugged into this that's actually being used, even if it's just an RGB color. It has to be somehow connected to the rendering material, otherwise it won't show. And then you have the visibility after setting, which controls whether the AOV appears in reflections or refractions or just in the primary rays. And then for the global texture, this is similar to the custom AOV, but it just basically applies to all the objects. For this to work, you actually have to dive inside of the render target and plug it into the actual global texture AOV nodes and to the texture pin. One other thing I want to mention are the output AOVs. To set these up, you can just dive inside of the render target. And so if we look here, we have our output AOV node, and to enable the output AOV, we have to check the enabled box in here. That's disabled by default. And then we can see that the output AOV popped up over here under AOVs. And currently it just has the beauty AOV plugged in. So that's all we can see right now. But then we can do some other stuff here. We can add effects like our post-processing effects. We can combine different AOVs, or we can actually use the open image denoiser. And so by plugging in whatever AOV you want to denoise and then bringing in the two denoise AOVs, we can then create custom denoise versions of any AOV that we want to. Let's move to the ROP, the render ROP, and basically this has some more like fundamental settings, and a lot of it is about the final output, or when you're actually like rendering the scene, not so much how it looks like in the IPR. In the main tab, we can select our render and IPR camera. We can select our render target, which in this case we're using the Octane Render setup, so it already sets it up for us. But if you're using the setup in the ROP and the material context, then you want to make sure that this is pointing to the right render target. You can use the override camera resolution here, and then you can set the rendering mode. In most cases, update scene works perfectly fine. If you have very big changes happening throughout your animation though, objects being turned off or on, for example, you might have to enable full scene reload mode. Just note that if you're exporting to Orbix, that will not work. But yeah, in most cases, update scene works well. And if you have situations where it doesn't, feel free to contact us and we might be able to see to improve this even more in the future. So let's talk about the output tab. So at first, in this first section, this controls whether or not when you hit render, it's also going to show you an mplay window. And that's what that selects. And then one note here is if you're rendering to ASUS and you kind of basically want to see the same thing in your mplay, like if I leave this enabled and I hit render, after a short minute, you're going to see an mplay window pop up, and then you'll see a preview of your render. However, even if you make sure that the ASUS display is turned on, this is way too dark. And the problem is this mplay use sRGB color space button. And I think what it does is basically, I don't know if it double applies sRGB or something, but if you're not rendering to sRGB but to ASUS, then you want to have that turned off. And then I found that that pretty much is all that's needed to get the same view in mplay and your IPR. This does not have nothing to do with your output file. This is just for mplay. Then you have your color space here that it's rendering to. Again, this is not related to your IPR. This is just where it renders to. If you're rendering to ASUS, you want to do ASUS-CG. Otherwise, you can leave this at the default type, and depending on whether you're rendering to sRGB or PNG, it will automatically pick your file type. Probably the same for JPEG, I would assume. And then obviously you have your file format. Deep image, this is something you want to enable if you want to render to deep image, and that will actually save this into the main AXR files. There's currently still the setting down here which saves your deep image to a separate deep file, if that's something you want to do. For AXR compression, I really like to use these two, the ones that these start with DW. They're much more compressed and result in much smaller file sizes, so I'm a big fan of those. If you're using the denoiser, but you also want to save the noisy image, you have to check this box here, save noisy image when the denoiser is enabled. Down here, if you enable this, that will now enable render layers, and so you can pick which ones you want to render, and also you'll be able to see them here. So in this case, the background is on layer 1, layer 2. Then in the properties panel, we have the ability to do clay rendering. If you don't want depth of field in your final render, you disable that here. Alternatively, you could also set like a really high f-stop in your camera. That's also an option. The override scene materials just lets you override all the materials in the scene with a custom material. Then the motion blur settings, we can basically enable a motion blur for different things, and then we have these motion blur steps. This is basically subsampling the frame. So let's say I add an animation, or in this case, I'm going to add an expression to this cube. And by the way, if you do expressions and you want subframe motion blur, make sure to use $FF, which creates like partial values, not just $F. So if I do this, you can see that, we should have a really fast rotating cube, but instead we have this kind of weird motion blur, and that's because we only have 2 motion blur steps when it comes to transform. So if I up this to like 20 and update my scene, you can see that now we have really nice rotating motion blur. Just an important note here, this kind of subframe sampling is not possible for deforming geometry. So if I was just rotating this box inside of SOPs by itself, I could not do this. So if you need this kind of subframe motion blur, either you have to do the transformation on the object level, so maybe use an object merge to bring it out and then animate it here, or you can use the packed geo-instancing, packing the object inside, and then selecting this, and that then will enable the instance motion blur steps for that to work. And then camera motion blur steps is for camera animation, obviously. And then shutter time you can use to basically change the amount of blur you get. So if I set this really low, you can see we just get a little bit of motion blur. This is basically like setting the shutter angle. Then the archive tab, this lets you export the scene to an Orbx file. This is useful for either viewing or using it in standalone. If you want to upload to the render network, that's also the file you will use. If you upload to the render network, I would highly recommend first checking the scene in Octane standalone to make sure everything's coming across correctly, because sometimes there might be errors. And then the third use for this would be instancing and using Orbx basically as a proxy. Currently, this is very limited, but we're planning to improve the Orbx usage inside of Houdini in the near future. Then we have the objects tab. This one just lets you include or exclude different objects. So for example, if I add the block here and then reload, you can see that they no longer render. And then finally, we have the scripts tab. This is basically just a place where you can set up scripts to run before you're rendering or before each frame or after. So for example, if you need a file structure created before you render, or you want to move your renders to a different location or create some kind of post-render report, this is the place where you could do that. So that's it. I hope that gave you a really good overview of the render settings for Octane for Houdini. Let me know if you have any questions, if I missed anything, or if you have a suggestion for a video that we should do in the future. I would also highly recommend you guys join the Octane Discord. It's a great place to ask questions. But yeah, thanks for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day. Happy rendering.